you're at home during the week, you can pull this up in the church app, and you can see where we're at in case you're wondering, hey, what's this Sunday going to be about? There you go. There it is. We're in week 2 of Jesus' prayer before the raising of Lazarus. And I'm really enjoying this series and learning a lot about Jesus, who was fully God and fully human at the same time. And you will see that this morning in the message. So I want to get a sense of direction. We're in John chapter 11 this morning, but I want to kind of give us a sense of direction on where John's been going in his gospel and where he's headed to. We kind of want to do this when we just sort of plop down in one chapter to kind of see what John's doing here in the Gospel of John. John 11 actually begins a transition. John 11 and John 12 are sort of a transition, a couple of chapters that lead into the Passion of Christ, the last week of Jesus' life. And so John 11 and John 12 are going to kind of set the stage for what's coming. And so we want to kind of keep that in mind as we move forward this morning. And notable is the fact that the raising of Lazarus from the dead falls at the beginning of this transition in this phase of Jesus' ministry. So it's always good to get a sense of direction with our passage. Some of us have a good sense of direction, and some of us have a not so good sense of direction. People say, I have a bad sense of direction. I just can't see where they're going with that, though. Okay. We should have a wake meter here to see if you're awake. Just checking to see if you're awake. But let's look together at John 11 and the prayer of Jesus and see what it is that we can learn about Jesus. I want to start with John 11, 1 through 4. Now a certain man was sick, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. And it was the Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. The sisters therefore sent to him, saying, Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick. But when Jesus heard it, he said, This sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified in it. So if we're wondering, where is John going in chapter 11? John tells us here in 11:4, it's about the glory of God, that Jesus would be glorified through Lazarus' death. So one of the key verses for this morning is John 11:4. And Jesus is telling us that he is going to be glorified through Lazarus' death. A great question to start out this morning's message would be, how will Jesus be glorified through Lazarus' death? How is that going to happen, that through someone's death, Jesus would be glorified? We'll pick it up in 11:5 and go all the way to 15, and we'll kind of see more of the story here. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. When, therefore, he heard that he was sick, he stayed then 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this, he said to the disciples, Let us go to Judea again. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and are you going there again? Jesus answered, Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles because the light is not in him. This he said, and after that he said to them, Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go that I may awaken him from his sleep. The disciples therefore said to him, Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will recover. Now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought he was speaking of literal sleep. Then Jesus therefore said to them plainly, Lazarus is dead, and I am glad for your sakes that I was not there, so that you may believe, but let us go to him. Why was Jesus glad? It's a great question. It almost seems out of place that at the news of Lazarus' death, Jesus would say he was glad. You know, there's certain things that you just don't say when hearing the news of someone's death. I was glad might be one of them. But Jesus says, I was glad that I was not there, so that you may believe, but now let us go to him. He was glad because he could show them that he had the power to raise Lazarus. I don't think that's a spoiler alert. I think we probably know that Lazarus is going to be raised from the dead, and Jesus is going to do this. I think this is probably why Jesus waited a couple extra days. In verse 6, it tells us that Jesus waited a couple more days to go to Lazarus. I wonder if he wanted to allow there to be enough time to make sure that everybody knew that Lazarus was dead. Remember the Princess Bride, that line, I'm mostly dead? Remember that? Jesus wanted to make sure everyone knew that Lazarus was fully dead, so that when he raised him, there would be no question about the miracle that he was about to do. But there seems to be some frustration on the part of some that Jesus didn't go right away. He received the news that Lazarus was sick, and he waited 2 days. Martha, down in verse 21, kind of complains to Jesus. She says, if you would have been here, my brother would not have died. Sometimes, to you and I, God's plans just don't make sense. Sometimes we're kind of trudging our way through this world, trying to make sense of what is happening and make sense of what God is doing. And it sort of begs the question for the believer. How important is it that we understand God's dealings in our lives? Is it really that important that we know what God is doing and why all the time? This is one of the things we saw in Jesus' prayer from last week. God determines when to reveal or keep hidden as he wishes. Now, Martha knew that her brother would rise again in the resurrection. She had this sort of Old Testament confirmation, a conviction that her brother would rise again in the resurrection, but she wanted her brother to be alive now. I've given you in your notes some of these verses just as a cross-reference. I believe you can click on those in the notes on the app and pull those up for future study if you want to look back at this later this week. Those are there just for reference to show that Martha understood about the resurrection and that her brother would rise again one day. I think that all of this is really a reminder that the Christian life involves a lot of trust. A lot of our Christian life is all about trusting what God is doing and following him in obedience. So we have this reminder that as Christians, we're to trust the Lord, even when life doesn't make sense. We have John 11:22, Martha expressing her trust that God would do whatever he would ask. But I know that even now, God will give you whatever you ask. So Martha's telling Jesus, I know that if you ask, that you can do whatever God wills. And God will do it. So Martha is a person of faith, but she's a person whose faith is developing and is growing. I think this is just one of the lessons in the Christian life that all of us have to learn at one point or other. We have to learn to trust in the moment and leave the big picture to God. To trust him in the moment when we don't understand what he's doing. Part of the whole story of the gospel is brought out through all four gospels, how the disciples, how the followers of Jesus were growing in their trust of who he was. It's part of what we see in the development of them. And whatever we believe about Jesus, we can know that the disciples grew convinced over 3 years that Jesus was indeed the Son of God, the Messiah. But that was something they had to grow to learn. They had to experience. Just like you and I grow in our faith. We grow to learn that Jesus is God's Son, and we can trust him. Interesting that all the disciples, minus one, were martyred for their confidence that Jesus was the Son of God, the Messiah. They believed it so strongly that almost every one of them gave up their lives with this conviction. See this in John 2:11 and 6:69. By the way, I did the slides this week, and I'm learning, so the font is a little small. So next week we'll bump it up a little bit. Hopefully you can read it. John 2:11. What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs with which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Then in John 6:69, we have come to believe and to know that you are the Holy One of God. And, all through the Gospels, we see the disciples, the followers of Christ, that we see their faith growing, their trust in who he was, built as the Gospels travel on. Wanted to show you John 11:33. We're working our way to that most famous verse, Jesus wept. But first we have John 11:33, and I want to read that together. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Some of the versions of the Bible actually say here, Jesus groaned. We know about Jesus wept. We're about to get to that in a minute. This is the lesser known Jesus groaned. This description here in the NIV that you see is a translation, but the Greek term for groaned always indicates anger and outrage or emotional indignation. This is a very strong. Jesus is frustrated here. He's groaning. Why is he groaning? He was angered because he observed the emotional grief of the people around him. He was watching the people react to Lazarus' death, and he was frustrated, and there was some anger coming out because of it. It says Jesus groaned. I was thinking about Christian funerals. Christian funerals really should be different, right? That when a Christian dies, we can have confidence that we'll see that person again, right? So Christian funerals should be different. But these people are really upset and sad because of Lazarus' death. And Jesus is frustrated in part because they don't understand about the resurrection. We know that Jesus cares deeply about people. This is one of the things that this passage, this prayer of Jesus brings out. Jesus cares deeply about people. Then we come to John 11:35. Every kid in Sunday school knows this verse. If you're going to have a contest and memorize passages of Scripture, if you're trying to memorize the most passages, every middle school and grade school child knows you start with John 11:35 because it's the shortest verse in the Bible, right? Jesus wept. It's true that Jesus wept. We know it because it's in the Bible. And you, by the way, you know that there are some people who only believe about 12.5% of the Bible. Those are the people we call the atheists. You got it. That one took me a while. I had to look it up to make sure that 12.5% was actually an 8. It's true. Some of Jesus' emotion here, though. Yes, Jesus was sad because of Lazarus dying. But some of his emotion here is because of the reaction he saw in the people who were his followers and their lack of understanding. Jesus loved Lazarus, but he was also grieved for a fallen world entangled in sin and not understanding about death and the resurrection. Here's a question for thought this morning. Was Jesus' emotion because of his humanity or because of his deity, or was it because of both? There's something to kind of think about as we travel on through the message this morning. Jesus was sad here. We also know, though, that Jesus raised some other folks, but on those occasions he didn't weep. We don't have time to look at them, but we have the widow's son in Luke 7:11 through 17, and we have Jairus' daughter in Matthew 9, 18 and 23 through 25. You can read those later this week if you like. But in both of those instances, Jesus didn't weep. So there's something different about this situation with Lazarus and Jesus weeping. We know that Jesus had closer friendships with some than with others. We know that Jesus was close with Peter, James, and John among the disciples. But Jesus also here loved Lazarus. It was described about Lazarus when the announcement of his death was given to him. The one you love is sick. So Jesus had closer relationships with some more than others. I was thinking about that this week. That really does reveal his humanity, because that's similar to our experience. We too have closer friendships with some than with others. There are always people we like more than others. I was thinking, if there weren't people we didn't like, we wouldn't know we like the people we like, right? And Jesus probably had that experience too. That's how human he really was. And he really did love Lazarus and was close to him and Martha and Mary. We'll note that the rabbis were seeking to stone him, but it didn't stop him from going to see Lazarus, Mary, and Martha. It shows that Jesus was even willing to risk his life in order to be with his close friend. And again, I've given you some cross references. We don't have time to look at them, but it shows Jesus' relationship with other followers. I have another question for thought as we think about Jesus and sadness and his weeping. Do you think that Jesus weeps now? We know that he's resurrected, right? And he's in heaven and he's preparing a place for you and I. And certainly he sees things that are going on here. And I'll bet he weeps when he sees things that grieve him now. Well, Jesus desires all to know that he is the resurrection and the life. It's our next big point, the next thing we learn about Jesus in this passage. We have John 11:25 through 26 that brings this out. I think the font just keeps getting smaller and smaller as we go. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? I find it really fascinating that Jesus asked this question before he raised Lazarus from the dead. He's getting their thinking going. He's getting them to think about what's about to happen. And he asks them this question. He presents to them about him being the resurrection and the life. Now that Lazarus was dead, the Lord was able to resurrect him, and in the process strengthen the faith of the disciples and all who would be watching him do this. And he's making the point that he didn't merely have the power to resurrect Lazarus, that he was the resurrection and the life. It's interesting how little bits and pieces of the gospel show up around these prayers of Jesus. I think it shows the heart of Christ, because in his most intimate moments with his Father, we see him thinking, talking about the gospel. And Jesus doesn't want you and I to be settled with a mediocre faith, does he? Just like the disciples and the followers of Christ, he wants us to grow in our faith and our trust with him. It's part of the Christian walk. This is one of the ways Jesus was glorified. He's glorified when people come to understand who he is, when people come to understand and trust him as the Savior, the Messiah. This question really runs all through the Gospel of John. It's one of the big questions in the Gospel of John. Who is Jesus? The question is asked and answered numerous times throughout this Gospel. Who is Jesus? It's really the greatest question that anyone could ever ask and answer, is it not? Who is Jesus? Was he who he said he was? Or was he a fake or a fraud? We believe that he was indeed the Son of God. Then we come to the heart of today's sermon. It's the prayer of Jesus in the midst of this situation. And it shows that Jesus desires for all to come to know that he is the Son of God. The prayer is in John 11:41 through 42. So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me. We made the point last week that sometimes when Jesus is praying, the benefit isn't just for a communication between him and his Father, but the benefit is also for the people who were standing around and watching and listening to what was happening. And Jesus' prayer here is not so much a petition. It's a prayer of thanks. So this miracle of raising Lazarus was going to authenticate who Jesus is. Sometimes these prayers show us who Jesus is. Seeing how Jesus interacted with his Father would convince some onlookers in their faith. It's interesting as I read this that some were convinced and some weren't. So there's sort of a mixed reaction among the crowds. We see this in a number of places. John 11:37. But some of them said, this is after the raising of Lazarus, could he not, or right before, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? They're questioning Jesus' power. Like, does he really have the power to raise this man from the dead? I mean, after all, didn't he give the blind man sight? And then in 11:43 through 44, when he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, take off the grave clothes and let him go. I find this fascinating here, that Jesus told some of them to take the grave clothes off. You know, if it wasn't enough that this guy they thought was dead comes walking out of the tomb, all wrapped in the, cloths, the strips of cloth that was wrapped around him, comes walking out. It would be a great passage to study over Halloween, right? He comes walking out, and if that wasn't enough, Jesus tells them to take the grave clothes off. Some of the ones, I almost would bet that some of the folks who were running up to Lazarus and pulling off the grave clothes were some of the ones who were questioning, could Jesus really do this? I think sometimes we need a hands-on learning experiment. And this was just that for these folks. Just as a side note, John 11:43, right after Jesus' prayer, the raising of Lazarus was to be a picture of the power to be fully displayed in the final resurrection, where the dead hear the voice of God and live. It's predicted in John 5:25, 28, and 29. John 5:25, very, very truly, I tell you, a time is coming and has now come when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. And then 28 to 29. Do not be amazed at this, for a time is coming when all who are in their grave, will hear his voice and come out. Those who have done what is good will rise to live, and those who have done what is evil will rise to be condemned. So the resurrection is predicted here earlier in the Gospel of John by Jesus. We have more mixed reaction in 11:45 through 46. Therefore, many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. So more mixed messages, more mixed reviews by those who saw what happened. I think you can tell who's on the Lord's side by who they're working with. We can tell who believed and who didn't. Who ran right to the Pharisees and said, "You wouldn't believe what he just did now." But others saw and believed. Another of the mixed review, and this is part of the transition into the Passion Week of Christ in John 11:47 through 53. It's a long section. I put it in the notes. We don't have time to read it all. But maybe I'll read especially 53. It says, "So from that day on, they planned together to kill him." Those folks ran and told the Pharisees and the chief priests what Jesus had done. Verse 53 tells us, from that day on, the chief priests planned to kill Jesus. The sad side of the mixed review. But for us, it's good news because this is what allowed for Jesus to die and be raised again. So I ask again the question we asked in the beginning. How would Jesus be glorified through Lazarus' death? Jesus would be glorified as he revealed who he is, and then through his crucifixion and resurrection that resulted in part from Lazarus' death. This is one of the events that paved the way and caused some to want to kill him. Imagine that, though, that Jesus did a wonderful thing for Lazarus, for Mary and Martha. He raised their brother from the dead. And all who looked on saw this happen, and yet still some went away and conspired to kill him. Well, as we think about what this message means for you and I today, I think there's still a mixed review today about Jesus, isn't there? There are some who today, if they saw Jesus, would want to kill him. There will always be a mixed review about Jesus. But one day, there will no longer be a mixed review. We know that Scripture tells us this, right? In Philippians 2:10 and 11, that at the name of Jesus, every knee should bow, in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. One day, Jesus will ultimately be glorified, and every knee will bow. We know that day is coming. And so today, for our takeaway, as we wrap up the message, I've given us this to think about. Because of what we know, and if we've chosen to be one who looked at Christ and said, "I believe him," if that describes us, I believe there is great cause to pray for those who are still in darkness. We see those who don't know Christ, who need the gospel, who need to be saved, and come to complete assurance that Jesus is Lord. For you and I, there's great cause to pray and to work toward their understanding. So with this, we'll close this morning's message.